The morning sun filtered through the gymnasium windows of Riverside Elementary School, casting long golden stripes across the polished hardwood floor. Officer had been making this route for 3 years now, every third Tuesday, like clockwork. But today, something felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the light hit the walls, or perhaps it was simply the weight he'd been carrying since his daughter turned 3 last month. Whatever it was, felt unusually alert as he guided Rex, his 5-year-old German Shepherd partner, through the gymnasium doors. Rex had always been exceptional. With his sleek black and tan coat, intelligent amber eyes, and an intuitive understanding of human emotion that seemed almost supernatural, Rex wasn't just a police dog. He was a bridge between the law enforcement community and the people they served. Together, they'd responded to 17 missing person cases, 14 drug busts, and countless community outreach programs. Rex had a way of sensing when a child was afraid or when an elderly person needed comfort. He could navigate a crowded room and somehow make every person feel like he was connecting with them personally. Officer was arranging training equipment on the gymnasium floor when Principal Torres approached, clipboard in hand. She was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun and kind eyes that suggested she genuinely cared about every child in her building. "Officer, we're so excited to have you here today," she said warmly. "The kindergarten and first-grade classes are lined up, and we even have some of our pre-K kids peeking through the windows already." Rex always makes them smile. Smiled back, patting Rex affectionately. "He loves this. Don't you, boy?" Rex's tail wagged in response, and Principal Torres laughed. As she turned to leave, began arranging cones and training obstacles, establishing a safe perimeter for the demonstration. He'd done this dozens of times. The routine was simple. Introduce Rex to the children, explain what police dogs do, demonstrate basic commands like sit, stay, and fetch. Then answer questions while the children got to pet Rex under careful supervision. It was wholesome community building, the kind of work that reminded why he joined the force in the first place. He was adjusting the height of one of the obstacles when movement caught his eye, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to trigger his trained observation skills. A small figure emerged from the doorway leading to the adjacent pre-K center. She was a tiny girl, no more than 3 or 4 years old, wearing pink overalls with white daisies embroidered across the chest. Her dark hair was braided into 2 neat pigtails secured with yellow ribbons that matched her shoes. She moved with the careful, deliberate steps of a child who knew she wasn't supposed to be somewhere, a quiet determination in her gait that seemed incongruous with her small frame. Officer watched as she paused at the gymnasium entrance, scanning the large open space as if assessing a threat. Her brown eyes, intelligent, serious, far too serious for such a young face, locked onto Rex. Without hesitation, without the typical shy approach or cautious distance that most young children maintained around large animals, she walked directly toward the German Shepherd. "Rex," said gently, not to command but to alert his partner. The dog's ears perked up, but he remained calm and seated, as trained. This was a teaching moment, thought. He'd explain to the child about approaching dogs safely, offer her a proper introduction, maybe give her a chance to pet Rex's head gently. What happened next would haunt Officer for the rest of his life. The girl didn't reach out to pet Rex with childish glee. Instead, she knelt down beside the dog, not sitting but kneeling as if in supplication, and leaned close to his ear. She glanced quickly at Officer, as if checking whether he was watching, and then her lips moved. Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet gymnasium it carried a weight that seemed to make the air itself grow heavier. "The dark room," she said, her tiny voice trembling with an emotion that seemed far too complex for her age. "The dark room with the bad sounds." Officer felt his body go rigid. Every instinct, every hour of training, every conversation with victims and witnesses suddenly crystallized into a single point of awareness. This was not normal child-to-dog interaction. The girl continued, her words spilling out faster now, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, as if Rex was a confessional and she was unburdening a soul weighted down by secrets. The man who smells like cigarettes and beer. His hands are cold. He tells me not to tell Mommy because she won't believe me. He says Mommy's too tired from work. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but he stopped himself. His years of experience as a detective before joining the K-9 unit kicked in. Don't react. Don't alert anyone else yet. Don't disrupt this disclosure. Document everything. His phone was in his pocket. He needed that recording. Slowly, carefully, moved closer, pretending to adjust Rex's leash, positioning himself so his phone's microphone could capture the child's whispered words. The girl's eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if she were in a trance state. Her words came with the cadence of something rehearsed, something that had been told to her repeatedly, until it became embedded in her memory like a script. But there was also an authenticity to her terror, a genuine fear that no child could fabricate. She understood what she was saying was serious. She understood it was wrong. "You won't tell, will you?" the girl asked Rex, her small hand gripping the dog's collar. "You're a police doggy, but you can keep secrets, right? Because nobody believes what dogs say anyway. That's what he told me. He said even if I told the police doggy, nobody would believe me because dogs can't talk." The implication was staggering. Someone had deliberately told this child that even a police dog couldn't help her. Someone had constructed a psychological cage so thoroughly calculated that it encompassed not just human authority figures, but even the symbols of protection and rescue. Officer's heart was pounding against his ribs. The gymnasium suddenly felt suffocating, despite its vast open space. The golden morning light that had seemed so peaceful just minutes ago now felt harsh and accusatory. He realized with a sick clarity that he was standing in the presence of a child disclosure of abuse, serious, systematic abuse, and the perpetrator had been clever enough to weaponize even the concept of help itself. The girl finally noticed Officer standing nearby. She didn't seem afraid of him, but there was a resignation in her expression, as if she expected him to do what all adults do: dismiss, deny, or worst of all, fail to act. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Officer asked, his voice carefully modulated to sound calm despite the storm building inside him. The girl looked at Rex one more time, as if drawing strength from the dog. Then she looked at Officer. "I'm Emma," she whispered, "and I need someone to listen." In that moment, Officer understood that his life, and the life of this small child, was about to change forever. Officer's training kicked in the moment Emma spoke those 4 words, "I need someone to listen." Years of interrogation courses, victim advocacy seminars, and field experience all converged into a single imperative: maintain calm, establish trust, and document everything. His hand moved slowly to his pocket, fingers finding his phone with practiced ease. He didn't look away from Emma as he activated the voice recording function. Every word she spoke from this moment forward could be evidence. Every detail could be the difference between prosecution and acquittal, between justice and silence. "Hello," Emma said, keeping his voice soft and steady, as if he were speaking to a frightened animal rather than a traumatized child. "Rex and I are really glad you're here. Would you like to tell us more? You can talk to Rex. He's a really good listener, and I promise we're going to help you." Emma's small body was trembling now, a physical manifestation of the emotional weight she was carrying. She was still kneeling beside Rex, one hand buried in his fur as if the dog were an anchor keeping her tethered to reality. The German shepherd, sensing the child's distress with that uncanny animal intuition, remained perfectly still. No fidgeting, no playfulness, just calm, steady presence. It was as if Rex understood that this moment transcended the typical rules of their training. "The man comes to our house," Emma continued, her voice growing slightly louder but no less tremulous. "He lives there now. Mommy says he's her boyfriend. He brings toys sometimes, a doll with yellow hair and a teddy bear that plays music. But then, She paused, her small jaw tightening as she struggled with the enormity of what she was trying to express. But then at night, when Mommy goes to work, he goes into my room. Officer felt bile rise in his throat. He kept his expression neutral, but internally, every alarm was screaming. This was classic predatory behavior, grooming with gifts, timing abuse when the protective parent was absent, psychological manipulation to ensure silence. And this child was describing it with the clinical precision of someone who'd been conditioned to speak about her abuse. "Does the man ever hurt you?" asked carefully, each word chosen with deliberation. He needed specific information without leading her, without planting suggestions in her young mind. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She seemed almost too experienced in suppressing emotion, a coping mechanism that broke heart even further. "He touches me in places that are private, places that are just mine. He says it's a game, but it doesn't feel like a game. Games are supposed to be fun. This isn't fun." The statement was so straightforward, so heartbreakingly honest, that had to take a deep breath to maintain his composure. He'd worked hundreds of cases, but something about hearing abuse described by a 3-year-old in her own innocent terminology always cut deepest. There was no performative quality to her words, no attempt to embellish or dramatize. This was pure, unfiltered truth emerging from a child who didn't yet have the sophistication to construct convincing lies. "What does the man look like?" asked, pulling out a small notepad from his jacket pocket, not to write. The recording would capture everything, but to ground himself in procedure, in the familiar steps of investigation. "He's tall, taller than Mommy," Emma said, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. "He has dark hair with some white in it, and he smells like cigarettes and beer and something else, something that makes my nose hurt. He always smells like that, but it's worse at night, and he has a scar here." She pointed to her own left eyebrow, mimicking the location. "He got it from a fight, I think. I heard him telling Mommy about it." His mind was already cataloging these details, cross-referencing them with the information he'd need to gather. He would need to speak with Emma's mother immediately. He would need to secure her residence for evidence collection. He would need to contact Child Protective Services, initiate a full investigation, and coordinate with detectives trained in child abuse cases. But first, he needed Emma to understand that she was safe now. "Emma, you're being so brave," said, lowering himself to a crouch so he was at eye level with her. "I know this is scary, and I know the man told you not to tell anyone, but you did the right thing. You told Rex, and Rex brought me to you, and now I'm going to make sure you're safe." Emma looked at him, and for the first time something that might have been hope flickered across her tear-stained face. "Really? You believe me?" "The man said nobody would believe me. He said I'm too little and people don't listen to little kids." "I believe you," said firmly. "And there are a lot of people who are going to believe you too. Police, doctors, and other people whose job is to help kids like you. You're going to be okay, Emma." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, wondered if they were true. He knew from experience that the path ahead would be grueling. Forensic interviews, medical examinations, testimony that might be challenged by defense attorneys, a legal system that didn't always protect children the way it should. The trauma Emma had already experienced would likely compound with the trauma of the investigation process itself. "The man also showed me pictures," Emma said suddenly, as if remembering something crucial. "Pictures of a dog. He said the dog was magic and could keep secrets. He said if I ever told anyone, nobody would believe me because dogs can't talk. But you're a policeman with a police dog, so maybe." She trailed off, looking between and Rex. "Maybe the dog told you anyway." The realization hit like a physical blow. The man, Emma's abuser, had deliberately weaponized the image of a police dog to further isolate her, to convince her that even symbols of authority and protection couldn't help her. He'd created a psychological prison so complete that it encompassed not just her family, but the very concept of rescue. Officer's phone buzzed in his pocket. The recording had been running for 8 minutes. 8 minutes that would change everything. "Emma," he said gently, I'm going to call some people who are going to help us. Is that okay? You're going to get to talk to a nice doctor and some other helpers, and they're all going to work together to keep you safe. Can you be brave for a little bit longer?" Emma nodded, still clutching Rex's fur. The dog looked up with those intelligent amber eyes and could have sworn the animal understood the gravity of the moment. As reached for his radio, his hand shaking slightly, he knew that the comfortable routine of community K9 demonstrations had just been shattered forever. What he'd stumbled upon in this gymnasium would set in motion an investigation that would expose a predator, protect a child, and ultimately reshape how law enforcement approached trauma disclosures. All because a 3-year-old girl had found the courage to whisper her secrets to a police dog. Officer, hands moved with practiced efficiency as he pressed his radio to his mouth. His voice, when it came, was calm and professional, betraying none of the turmoil churning beneath his composure. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12 with Officer. I need immediate assistance at Riverside Elementary School Gymnasium. Child Protective Services and Detective Unit to respond Code 2. We have a potential child abuse disclosure." The gymnasium, which moments before had seemed bright and welcoming with its polished floors and morning sunlight, now felt like a crime scene. Emma remained beside Rex, the dog's steady presence seemingly the only thing anchoring her to emotional stability. Kept speaking into his radio, providing minimal details but enough to convey urgency. He used the specialized language of his profession: alleged perpetrator, ongoing abuse pattern, evidence of grooming behavior, terms that stripped away the human tragedy and reduced it to procedural necessity. It was a coping mechanism he developed over years of handling the darkest aspects of human behavior. Within 15 minutes, the gymnasium had transformed into a coordinated command center. Officer Jennifer Martinez, a Child Protective Services investigator had worked with on 3 previous cases, arrived first. She was a compact woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail and an expression of determined compassion that immediately put vulnerable children at ease. Behind her came Principal Torres, her earlier cheerfulness completely evaporated, replaced by shock and professional concern. The gymnasium doors were quietly closed, and a uniformed officer positioned himself outside to prevent unauthorized entry. "Officer, walk me through it," Martinez said, pulling out her tablet. She'd learned to work efficiently in these situations. There was never time for lengthy explanations. Provided the essentials: Emma's disclosure, the specific details about the man, the physical descriptions, the reference to photographs of a police dog, the timeline of abuse coinciding with her mother's work schedule. Martinez listened without interrupting, her fingers flying across her tablet screen, documenting every detail. When he finished, she looked toward Emma with an expression that somehow managed to convey both profound sadness and absolute determination. "I'm Jennifer," she said, approaching Emma slowly, allowing the child to see her coming. "I work with kids who need help, kind of like Officer and Rex do. Would it be okay if we talked in a quieter place? Somewhere we can sit down and talk about what happened?" Emma looked at Rex, then at Officer, seeking silent permission, nodded encouragingly. "It's okay, Emma. Jennifer is one of the helpers I told you about. She's going to listen to your story and she's going to help keep you safe." As Martinez gently led Emma from the gymnasium, felt the weight of what was about to unfold settle onto his shoulders. What came next would be meticulous, methodical, and potentially traumatic for the child. Emma would be taken to a specialized interview facility, spaces designed specifically for child forensic interviews, equipped with cameras and one-way observation windows so that detectives, prosecutors, and specialists could observe without pressuring or re-traumatizing the child. Within the hour, Detective Sarah arrived at the gymnasium. She was in her 50s, with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades pursuing predators. She'd worked child abuse cases for nearly 20 years and had the grim determination of someone who'd seen the absolute worst that humans could do to the most vulnerable. She listened to his account with growing intensity, occasionally asking clarifying questions about Emma's specific language and behavioral cues. "We need to locate the mother immediately," said, already dialing her phone. "And we need to establish whether there's an active, ongoing threat in that household." The call to Sarah was handled with careful precision, was contacted at her workplace, a medical office where she worked as a receptionist, and informed that there was a situation involving her daughter that required her immediate presence at the police station. No details were provided over the phone. Such conversations needed to happen face-to-face, where trained personnel could manage the inevitable emotional crisis that was about to unfold. Sarah arrived at the police station 45 minutes later, her face a mask of confusion and mounting panic. She was a woman in her late 20s with dark eyes identical to Emma's and the exhausted appearance of someone working too many hours to make ends meet. When she was escorted into a private interview room and informed that her daughter had disclosed abuse, she seemed physically struck by the information, as if the words had physical weight. "No, that's not possible," said immediately, shaking her head in denial. "David would never. He's been so good with Emma. He buys her things, he plays with her, She stopped abruptly, the implications of what she was saying suddenly crystallizing. Her face went pale. Oh my God, no." Detective had conducted this conversation countless times. She knew the stages that parents went through: denial, shock, guilt, anger, and eventually, acceptance and cooperation. She remained patient as cycled through these emotions, occasionally placing a box of tissues within reach as the woman's tears began to flow. "When was the last time you saw David Torres?" asked gently. "This morning," whispered. "He was still sleeping when I left for work. He watches Emma during the day while I'm at the office. I thought she was safe." Those 5 words, "I thought she was safe," seemed to break something inside Sarah. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that comes from realizing you've failed the most important person in your life, but knew that herself was not the perpetrator here, was a victim of manipulation, a single mother desperate enough to accept help without questioning it thoroughly enough. "We're going to need you to answer some questions about David Torres," continued. "Where does he go during the day? Does he have family in the area? What vehicle does he drive? Any prior relationships you know about? We're going to need as much information as you can provide." As provided biographical details about David Torres, other investigators were already working. Officers were being dispatched to Cedress to establish whether Torres was still present in the home. Background checks were being run. Social media accounts were being monitored. A BOLO be on lookout alert was being issued to every patrol officer in the county, providing Torres' description and vehicle information. Back at the specialized interview facility, a forensic interviewer with 15 years of experience was beginning her session with Emma. The room was designed to feel safe and non-threatening: soft colors, age-appropriate furniture, no harsh lighting. Multiple cameras captured Emma from different angles, and through a one-way mirror, detective and 3 other specialists observed, taking notes and formulating next steps. "Tell me about your friend Rex," began, establishing rapport before moving to the difficult topics. "He seems like a special dog." Emma brightened slightly at the mention of Rex. "He's a police dog. He keeps people safe. The man said even police dogs can't help me, but officer proved him wrong." Felt a chill run down her spine at those words. This child had internalized a narrative of hopelessness so complete that she'd needed irrefutable proof, in the form of a police officer, to believe that rescue was possible. As the interview continued, as the investigation expanded, as the wheels of the criminal justice system began to turn, Officer sat in an observation room and watched a 3-year-old girl reclaim her voice and her truth. The gymnasium demonstration that had seemed so routine just hours ago had become the catalyst for saving a child's life. The search for David Torres was now in full effect. Detective Sarah sat in the organized chaos of the police station's detective bullpen, surrounded by files, photographs, and the accumulated detritus of a rapidly expanding investigation. It was now 6:47 p.m., barely 8 hours since Officer had made the initial report, and the investigation into David Torres had already consumed the attention of 6 detectives and 2 administrative assistants. The whiteboard on the wall behind's desk bore the beginning of a timeline: Torres' background, known associates, employment history, and a series of question marks representing the gaps they needed to fill. "I've got something," Detective called out from across the room, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who just uncovered a significant lead. Was a lean man in his early 50s with prematurely gray hair and the focused intensity of someone who'd built a career on meticulous attention to detail. He gestured over to his computer terminal. "I ran Torres through the system, sealed juvenile record from when he was 16, arrested for breaking and entering, got probation. Then 23 months ago, arrested for possession with intent to distribute cocaine. He did a year in county jail, got released 14 months ago." Leaned over shoulder, scanning the records. The timeline was crucial. Torres had been released from incarceration roughly 3 months before Sarah had met him. Around the same time, he'd begun his employment at Riverside Animal Shelter. It was a detail that sent alarm bells ringing through his experienced mind. "Pull his employment records," said immediately. "And I want to know everything about that animal shelter. Who runs it, who works there, what animals they house, and most importantly, any connections to our police department." While began making calls and accessing employment records, Detective Lisa, no relation to Officer, was working a different angle. She sat at her desk with a stack of printouts from social media, piecing together Torres' digital footprint. His Facebook page, which had been active until 2 weeks ago, showed photographs of him at various locations: parks, restaurants, a concert venue, and multiple images at what appeared to be an animal shelter. In many of these photographs, Torres was posing with dogs, lots of dogs. "This is interesting," said, flagging over. She pointed to a series of photographs dated approximately 6 months ago. In them, Torres stood with his arm around a German Shepherd, the dog's fur pattern and distinctive markings unmistakably similar to Rex. "Look at the location tag on these photos. They're from Riverside Animal Shelter. And look at this one. There's a girl in the background." His breath caught. In the background of one photograph, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a small child with dark hair and pigtails. Emma. And she was petting the same dog that Torres had his arm around. "When was this photo posted?" demanded. 6 months ago, exactly," replied. "And if I'm reading the metadata correctly, Sarah's Facebook profile shows she visited the animal shelter on this exact date. She even posted about it. Taking my little Emma to see the animals. She loves dogs," with a heart emoji. The implications crystallized with horrible clarity. Torres had orchestrated his own introduction to Emma. He'd worked at the facility, positioned himself to be present when Sarah brought her daughter, and deliberately made himself memorable to the child. It wasn't a coincidence or a chance meeting. It was calculated, premeditated grooming. "Get me everything on that animal shelter," said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I want to know if Torres had unsupervised access to children, what his responsibilities were, whether there were any complaints or concerns raised about his behavior." Hung up his phone, his expression darkening. "You're going to want to hear this. Riverside Animal Shelter received a grant from the City Police Department approximately 18 months ago. The grant was specifically designated for K-9 training and community outreach programs. The police department's K-9 unit trains dogs there on a regular basis. Officers come in, work with the shelter's animals, and then the shelter coordinates community demonstration days." Stood abruptly, her mind racing through the implications. So Torres, working at the shelter, would have had access to information about police dog training, behavioral patterns, and potentially even schedules for community demonstrations. Exactly, confirmed. And it gets worse. I spoke with the shelter director. She remembers Tors being obsessive about the police dog training. He'd attend every session, ask detailed questions about how dogs respond to different stimuli, whether dogs could be used for therapeutic purposes. She thought it was just general interest, but looking back, she says his questions were unusually specific and sometimes inappropriate. At that moment, another detective, Martinez, approached with a folder containing security footage. "We got lucky with the convenience store near's apartment. They have cameras covering the parking lot. I've been reviewing footage from the past month." Martinez arranged several printed stills across his desk. The images were grainy but clear enough to be meaningful. They showed David Tors, definitely Tors, entering the convenience store at 2:14 a.m. on 7 different occasions over the past month. In 5 of those instances, he'd purchased beer and cigarettes. In 2 instances, he'd purchased children's items, a doll, a teddy bear. "What time does Sarah work?" asked. "Night shift," detective provided, scrolling through her notes. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days a week. So Tors knew he had a window of approximately 6 hours when the apartment would be his and Emma's alone. Felt the sick familiar sensation of a predatory pattern revealing itself. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a moment of weakness or loss of control. This was a predator who'd identified a vulnerable target, systematized his approach, and deliberately positioned himself to exploit a child while ensuring that the protective parent would be absent. "Find Tors," said decisively. "I want every unit in this county looking for him. Check his known associates, his family members, any places he's rented, anywhere he might hide. And I want his apartment sealed and processed for evidence immediately." Officer coordinated with the evidence team to obtain a search warrant for Tors' residence. While that process unfolded, detective made another crucial discovery. He'd contacted Riverside Animal Shelter and spoken with an employee who remembered something important. Tors had been terminated from his job 11 weeks ago. The reason cited in his employment file was inappropriate behavior around animals and children. The shelter director, when pressed, admitted that they'd had concerns about Tors' interactions with kids during community events, but hadn't wanted to make accusations without concrete evidence. 11 weeks ago, said quietly, that's approximately when Tors moved in with. The timeline was becoming horrifyingly clear. Tors had lost his job at the shelter, probably because his inappropriate behavior had been noticed, and had then accelerated his grooming of Sarah and Emma. He'd moved into their home where he had unsupervised access to a small, vulnerable child. And he'd used the memory of a police dog, deliberately twisted into a tool of psychological control, to ensure her silence. By 9:30 p.m., search teams were positioned around David Tors' last known address. Officers were stationed at his family home in another county. A photograph of Tors had been distributed to every patrol unit, every gas station, every business in the metropolitan area. The investigation had expanded exponentially, now involving not just the police department's detective division, but also the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force, who'd been contacted given the interstate family connections. Detectives stood in the command center, looking at the growing web of information on the whiteboard. Each new detail, each connection, each piece of evidence was another thread in the net that would eventually ensnare David Tors. She thought of Emma, that small girl with too much knowledge and not enough childhood, and she thought of the moment when that child had whispered her secrets to a police dog. Justice knew was rarely swift or simple, but tonight the machinery of law enforcement was grinding into motion with single-minded purpose. David Tors was about to discover that he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated the voice of a 3-year-old child. The police department's video analysis lab was a cramped, climate-controlled room filled with multiple monitors and the accumulated technical equipment necessary for reviewing hours of surveillance footage. Detective Sarah had been staring at screens for the past 4 hours, cross-referencing timestamps, vehicle movements, and Tor's patterns of behavior. Her eyes burned from the blue light of the monitors, and empty coffee cups littered the desk beside her keyboard, but she remained focused with the intensity of someone who could sense they were approaching a critical breakthrough. Beside her, technical analyst James was methodically reviewing footage from the convenience store located 3 blocks from Sarah's apartment building. The store's security cameras captured not just the interior but also the parking lot, providing a broader view of nighttime movements in the area. Had been marking timestamps whenever Tors appeared, building a visual record of his nocturnal activities. Here said, pointing to the screen, "This is from 3 nights ago, 1:47 a.m. The grainy footage showed David Tors entering the convenience store. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, suggesting he was aware of the cameras, or at least deliberately obscuring his identity. Watch what he does." Clicked through several frames in sequence. Tors purchased cigarettes and beer, then lingered near the candy aisle. He selected a small teddy bear from a shelf of impulse purchase items and brought it to the register. The time stamp on the receipt indicated 2:03 a.m. "The bear," said quietly. "Emma mentioned receiving a teddy bear that plays music." "Exactly," confirmed. He pulled up his analysis spreadsheet. "I've mapped out every visit Tors made to this store over the past month. 7 total visits, all between 1:45 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., and every single one coincides with Sarah's documented work schedule. She works 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which means Tors had a 6-hour window of unsupervised access." Leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the evidence accumulating. But she knew that surveillance footage and timeline correlations, while compelling, weren't enough to build a prosecution case that would withstand a competent defense attorney. She needed something more concrete, something that would establish the pattern of premeditation and psychological manipulation. "What about his vehicle?" asked. Brought up a new file. 1993 Ford Ranger Silver, registered to David Tors. "I've been tracking it through traffic cameras and private business security footage. The pattern is remarkable. It's almost ritualistic. He leaves apartment around 1:45 a.m., drives to the convenience store, purchases items, then returns to the apartment by approximately 2:30 a.m. He stays in the apartment for about 3 to 4 hours before leaving again around 5:00 or 5:30 a.m. That roughly aligns with when he'd return the items to the child." Felt her stomach turn at the clinical precision of the timeline. This wasn't spontaneous abuse or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a predator operating according to a carefully constructed schedule, utilizing the predictability of his victim's mother's work schedule to orchestrate his crimes. Meanwhile, in another section of the police station, Detective was making progress on a different front. He'd obtained the complete employment records from Riverside Animal Shelter, along with documentation of all police department K-9 training sessions conducted at the facility. What he found was profoundly disturbing. Over the course of Tors' 16 months at the shelter, there had been 23 separate K-9 training sessions conducted by the police department. Tors had attended 17 of them. More significantly, according to witness statements from shelter employees, Tors had exhibited what multiple people described as unusual interest in the police dog's behavioral training, specifically asking questions about how dogs responded to trauma and distress signals, whether dogs could be conditioned to recognize and respond to specific individuals, the extent of police dogs' memory retention for individual people, how dogs could be used in therapeutic contexts. Showed this documentation to Detective, and her eyes widened as she read through the compiled statements. He was studying how to exploit the dog-human bond, said quietly. He understood that police dogs have specific training, specific behavioral patterns. He knew how dogs respond to authority and trauma. pulled up the police department's K-9 training logs on her computer. She scrolled through the documentation until she found the entry she was looking for. A training session conducted at Riverside Animal Shelter approximately 7 months ago, led by Officer and his partner, Rex. The log indicated that the training had been open to shelter staff and documented that David Torres had been present and had participated in a question-and-answer session following the demonstration. "He met Rex," said, the realization settling over her like a cold fog. "He was there when Officer was training with Rex at the shelter." The implications cascaded through her mind. Torres had identified Emma at the shelter months earlier. He'd positioned himself to meet the police dog, understanding the animal as a symbol of authority and protection. Then, he'd weaponized that symbol, using it to construct a psychological cage around Emma, convincing her that even a police dog couldn't help her because dogs can't talk. Leaned forward, reading from his notes. And here's the connection that really ties it together. Torres attended a community demonstration day at the shelter where Officer brought Rex. That's where Sarah brought Emma. We have photographic evidence from that day. Torres is in 7 different photographs with the police dog, and Emma is visible in the background of 3 of them. Stood abruptly, packing the small office as the full scope of Torres' manipulation became clear. He didn't randomly meet Sarah and Emma. He positioned himself at that shelter. He cultivated a relationship with Officer and Rex, and he deliberately engineered an introduction to the child. Then, when he lost his job, presumably because his behavior was becoming noticeably inappropriate, he accelerated his predatory timeline. He moved into his home and began the abuse, while simultaneously using the memory of the police dog as a control mechanism. A forensic psychologist consultant, Dr., had been brought in to provide insight into Emma's psychological state and the likely mechanisms of Torres' manipulation. She'd reviewed Emma's forensic interview and had provided her analysis to detective. "Emma has clearly internalized a narrative of helplessness," Doctor had written in her report. "The perpetrator deliberately constructed a psychological framework in which even symbols of authority and protection, specifically a police dog, are rendered powerless. This accomplishes multiple objectives for the perpetrator. It isolates the victim by convincing her that help is impossible. It creates a false sense of control and power for the perpetrator, and it prevents the victim from reaching out for assistance." But Doctor had also noted something crucial. The child's discourse regarding the police dog suggests she may be engaging in what we might call projected testimony. She has unconsciously attributed her desire for help to the dog, essentially telling the dog's story, as a way of circumventing her own internalized prohibition against disclosure. The appearance of the actual police dog and officer may have triggered a psychological breakthrough where the child realized that the perpetrator's narrative, that dogs cannot help, was demonstrably false. This realization transformed the investigation. Emma hadn't randomly chosen to confide in Rex. Her psyche had identified the police dog as the only entity she'd been convinced couldn't betray her, because, according to Torres' manipulation, the dog couldn't communicate anyway. But when she saw the actual police dog, with an actual police officer who could and would listen, her psychological defenses had cracked. Documented all of this in a comprehensive report that was submitted to the district attorney's office. The pattern was clear, the evidence was mounting, and the psychological mechanisms of Torres' abuse were becoming increasingly apparent. By midnight, the investigation had expanded to include coordination with the FBI's Crimes Against Children Task Force. Torres remained at large, but the noose was tightening. The question was no longer whether they had enough evidence. The question was whether they could find him before he ran. David Torres was arrested at 3:47 a.m. outside a motel in Riverside County, approximately 50 miles from the city. A state trooper had spotted his silver Ford Ranger matching the Bolo description abandoned on the property, and Torres himself had been found asleep in one of the motel rooms, registered under a false name with cash payment. He'd been traveling alone, carrying minimal belongings and approximately $1,200 in cash, enough, law enforcement surmised, for a brief flight before eventual capture. When arrested, Torres had been cooperative in a superficial way, offering no resistance but also offering no explanation for his flight. Now at 8:15 a.m., Torres sat in the interrogation room at police headquarters. The room was deliberately austere: gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs, and a single mirror that Torres knew was actually a one-way observation window. He wore an orange jumpsuit provided by the county jail, his dark hair disheveled, his earlier arrogance stripped away by the reality of his incarceration. He'd requested a public defender, which meant Detective Sarah and her partner, Detective James, would proceed with a limited scope interrogation designed to gather information without compelling any statements that might later be suppressed due to lack of legal counsel. But had a strategy. She had evidence that was so conclusive, so damning, that she believed Torres would eventually break under the weight of it. "Let me walk you through this," said, sliding a folder across the metal table toward Torres. She kept her voice conversational, almost friendly, as if she and Torres were colleagues discussing a mutual problem. "Because I think you're going to want to understand exactly how thoroughly we've documented your activities." Torres didn't touch the folder. His hands remained folded on the table in front of him, and his eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere above his head, the classic posture of someone attempting to project indifference while internally spiraling. Opened the folder regardless and began laying out documentation. "Here we have surveillance footage from Riverside Animal Shelter showing you attending 17 police K-9 training sessions over the course of 16 months. 16 of you have provided statements indicating that you were obsessed, their word, not mine, with learning about police dog behavior, police dog training protocols, and therapeutic applications of K-9 partnerships." She placed another set of documents on the table. "Here we have photographic evidence from a community demonstration day conducted by Officer and his police dog, Rex, at the shelter. You're in 7 different photographs with that dog. In 3 of those photographs, 3-year-old Emma is visible in the background. And here, tapped a specific photograph. Here's Sarah's own Facebook post from that exact day, where she documented taking her daughter to see the animals." Torres' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. "Next, we have convenience store surveillance footage documenting that you left Sarah's apartment at 1:45 a.m. on 7 separate occasions over the past month, always during her night shift work schedule. You purchased items at the convenience store, cigarettes, beer, children's toys, and returned to the apartment approximately 45 minutes later. We have timestamps correlating your arrivals and departures with the times Emma disclosed in her forensic interview." Pulled out her phone and played an audio recording. It was Emma's voice, captured during the forensic interview, describing the man who smells like cigarettes and beer, detailing his physical description, including the scar above his left eyebrow, a scar that was clearly visible on David Torres' face right now. "We have cell phone records showing that Sarah's phone was stationary at her workplace during every single one of these incidents," continued. "We have physical evidence collected from your residence, specifically children's toys, photographs, and personal items belonging to Emma that she identified during her interview. We have DNA evidence, forensic evidence, and most importantly, we have a 3-year-old child who has provided a detailed, consistent, emotionally authentic account of your abuse." Torres' hands began to tremble slightly, noticed and pressed forward, sensing the beginning of the psychological break she'd been working toward. "What I don't understand," said, leaning back in her chair and adopting a more conversational tone, "is why you thought weaponizing a police dog would work. Why you deliberately told a 3-year-old child that even a police dog couldn't help her. That was a critical miscalculation, David. That's the detail that transformed this from a crime that might have remained hidden into a crime that exposed itself because of a child's desperate need to be heard. Tor's breathing became noticeably deeper. His eyes, which had been staring at the wall, suddenly focused on his face. She saw something shift in his expression, the moment when denial began to crumble. "I've interviewed hundreds of child abuse cases," continued, her voice steady and almost sympathetic. "And I've learned that victims often find ways to disclose their abuse, even when they've been told not to, even when they've been psychologically manipulated into believing that help is impossible. Because something inside them, something fundamental and unbreakable, knows that what's happening to them is wrong. That something is more powerful than any manipulation tactic." Tor suddenly covered his face with his hands, his shoulders beginning to shake. For several minutes he remained that way, silent except for the sound of his breathing. Waited, recognizing the signs of psychological breakdown. Detective, who'd been standing silently near the door, moved slightly closer. When Tors finally lowered his hands, his face was streaked with tears, and something fundamental seemed to have shifted within him. The facade of indifference had collapsed entirely. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Tors said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not. I didn't want to hurt her." "Then why did you?" asked, her tone gentle but unwavering. Tors was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words came in a halting, disconnected stream, as if they were being dragged from somewhere deep and dark within him. He confessed to inappropriate contact with Emma on multiple occasions, always late at night, always when Sarah was at work. He described showing Emma photographs on his phone, photographs of wrecks, of police officers, of authority figures, while telling her that nobody would believe her, and that even police dogs can't talk. She was so compliant, Tors said, and then immediately seemed horrified by his own word choice. "I didn't use force, she didn't understand, she was so young. I told her it was a game, that it was something special between us, that Mommy would be upset if she found out. I made her think she was protecting her mother by keeping the secret." The confession continued for the next hour, becoming increasingly detailed and increasingly damning. Tors described his deliberate positioning at the animal shelter, his calculation of Sarah's work schedule, his strategic movement into their home. He explained that he'd specifically chosen to discuss police dogs with Emma because he'd read an article about a child who disclosed abuse to a school counselor by talking through her stuffed animal. He'd theorized that if he convinced Emma that a police dog couldn't communicate, the dog would become a safe repository for her secrets that she'd never actually disclosed to authorities. "I was wrong," Tors finally said, burying his face in his hands again. "I was completely wrong. She found the courage anyway." Detective sat back, knowing that the confession was complete. The evidence was irrefutable, the confession was voluntary and documented, and the case against David Tors was now essentially unassailable. She stood, signaling to Detective that the interrogation was concluded. As exited the interrogation room, she passed through the observation window area where several other officers and prosecutors had been witnessing the confession. They looked at her with expressions of grim satisfaction. The predator had been caught. The lies had been exposed, and a 3-year-old child's whispered words had proved more powerful than any manipulation tactic devised by an adult predator. Justice, it seemed, did sometimes move swiftly after all. Sarah sat in the waiting room of the family courthouse, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. It was a Wednesday morning, 3 days after David Tors' confession, and she was about to testify before a family court judge regarding emergency custody arrangements for her daughter. The weight of her failure, or what she perceived as her failure, pressed down on her shoulders with such force that she sometimes found it difficult to breathe. Beside her sat her mother, Martinez, a retired elementary school teacher in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that were currently red-rimmed from crying. Had raised Sarah after Sarah's father passed away when she was 8 years old. She taught her daughter about trust, about love, about the importance of protecting the vulnerable. And now was here to support her daughter through the consequence of misplaced trust in a predatory man. "It's not your fault," said quietly, reaching over to gently unclasp her daughter's white-knuckled hands. "You couldn't have known. You did everything a mother is supposed to do. You worked hard to provide. You were looking for stability and companionship. There's no shame in that." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But Emma was in my care. She was my responsibility, and I brought a monster into our home. How do I ever forgive myself for that?" Squeezed her daughter's hand. "The same way Emma is going to forgive herself for not knowing it was wrong, by accepting that you're human and humans make mistakes. The difference is, you're going to spend the rest of your life making sure Emma knows she's safe and loved." The judge's decision, delivered 20 minutes later, was swift and decisive. Emma would be placed in the temporary custody of her grandmother, Martinez, pending the completion of a comprehensive family assessment and psychological evaluation. Sarah would maintain visitation rights, supervised at first, and would be required to complete a parenting education program focused on recognizing warning signs of abuse and creating protective environments for children. The court also mandated family therapy for both Sarah and Emma, with separate individual therapy sessions for Emma focused on trauma recovery. As the judge's gavel came down, Sarah felt something inside her both break and begin to heal simultaneously. Emma's first week with her grandmother was filled with small, tentative steps toward normalcy. Home was a sanctuary, a place filled with books, comfortable furniture, and the accumulated warmth of a life lived with intention and love. The house smelled like her grandmother's lavender sachets and the cinnamon rolls baked every Sunday. It was a deliberate contrast to the chaos and violation that had characterized Emma's recent past. But Emma carried trauma in her small body in ways that went far beyond what could be healed by a comfortable home. She had nightmares. She woke up screaming. She exhibited what the trauma specialist, Dr. Rachel, described as hypervigilance, a constant state of alertness, as if she was perpetually expecting danger to emerge from any corner. "This is normal," Doctor explained during their first consultation. "Emma's nervous system has been conditioned to expect threat and violation. She's going to need time, consistency, and professional support to recalibrate her understanding of safety." Doctor was a woman in her late 40s with a gentle demeanor and extensive training in childhood trauma recovery. She'd worked with abuse survivors for over 2 decades and possessed the kind of patient wisdom that came from understanding that healing was rarely linear. She scheduled twice-weekly individual sessions with Emma, focusing on evidence-based trauma therapy, including cognitive processing and somatic experiencing techniques adapted for a preschool-age child. "We use a combination of play therapy, art therapy, and talk therapy," Doctor explained to both and Sarah during a joint consultation. "Emma's verbal skills are limited by her age, so we give her other channels through which to process her trauma. Through play, through drawing, through movement, we help her body and mind integrate the traumatic memories and begin to contextualize them as past events rather than ongoing threats." Sarah participated in weekly parent coaching sessions with Doctor, learning how to recognize Emma's trauma responses, how to help her regulate her nervous system, and how to create an environment that balanced safety with gradually expanding her daughter's sense of agency and control. It was intensive, emotionally demanding work, but Sarah approached it with a determination born from maternal love and deep guilt. 3 weeks after Emma's placement with Officer received a phone call from Detective Sarah. "We'd like to arrange something," explained. "Emma's made significant progress in therapy, and her therapist believes she might benefit from a controlled, supervised interaction with Rex. The dog has become a symbol. We want to help her reclaim that symbol from trauma and transform it into something healing." Officer immediately agreed. The arrangement was carefully coordinated with Doctor, who prepared Emma for the visit extensively. They talked about Rex, about what had happened, about how the dog wasn't responsible for David Torr's actions. They created a narrative where Rex became not an unwilling accomplice to abuse, but a potential ally in recovery. The visit took place in a secure, comfortable room at the police department's community center, not the gymnasium where Emma's disclosure had first occurred, but a different space entirely. Emma sat with Doctor, and on one side of the room while Officer guided Rex through the doorway. The German Shepherd, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, approached Emma slowly. He didn't jump or attempt to play. Instead, he sat approximately 3 feet away from the child, his amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that suggested he understood something significant was happening. Emma's entire body tensed initially. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands gripped the fabric of her grandmother's sweater. But slowly, as she watched the dog simply sit, simply exist in proximity without threat or demand, something began to shift in her small face. "He remembers you," Officer said softly. "Rex remembers the girl who talked to him, and he's been waiting for you to know that he heard you, that you were brave and that you changed everything." Doctor placed a small piece of dog treat in Emma's trembling hand. "You can give him this if you want to, or you can just sit. There's no pressure. Rex is just here to visit." Emma stared at the treat, then at the dog, then back at her grandmother. Nodded encouragement. Slowly, with movements that seemed to require enormous effort, Emma extended her arm toward Rex. The dog approached with gentle deliberation and took the treat from her hand, his mouth soft against her small palm. Emma didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted. She took a shuddering breath. "He's safe," she whispered. "Yes," Doctor confirmed, "and so are you." Over the following weeks, Emma had 3 more supervised visits with Rex. Each visit was slightly longer, slightly less tense. By the 4th visit, Emma was able to pet Rex's head without trembling. By the 5th visit, she whispered something to the dog, not words of pain and trauma, but words that Doctor later described as a reclamation of agency. "Thank you for listening," Emma had whispered to Rex. "Thank you for telling the policeman." Sarah attended a family day session with Doctor 2 months after David Torr's arrest. This was the first time she'd seen Emma since the child had been placed, with supervised visits had been delayed, while Emma worked through the most acute phase of her trauma. When Emma entered the room and saw her mother, she froze. Sarah held her breath, uncertain whether her daughter would approach her or retreat. The bond between mother and child had been damaged by violation that occurred under the mother's roof, even though the violation had been perpetrated by someone else. Rebuilding that bond required both forgiveness and accountability. Emma took 3 small steps forward. Then she wrapped her arms around her mother's legs in a tentative hug. Sarah lowered herself to the floor and held her daughter, both of them crying, Sarah with grief and guilt, Emma with the complicated emotions of a child learning to trust again. "I love you," Sarah whispered. "I am so sorry." Emma didn't respond with words, but she didn't pull away either. She simply held on, her small body pressed against her mother's, both of them beginning the long, difficult journey of healing together. 6 months after David Torr's arrest, the Superior Court of the county rendered its formal sentencing. Torr stood before Judge, a woman known throughout the legal system for her unwavering commitment to protecting children. The courtroom was packed. Law enforcement personnel, child protection advocates, and several members of the media who'd been following the case since Emma's initial disclosure. The victim impact statement was delivered not by Emma herself, but by her grandmother, Martinez, reading words that Emma had drawn as pictures and communicated through her therapy sessions. As described, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the profound sense of betrayal that Emma carried in her small body, Torr stared at the floor. There was no remorse visible on his face, only a hollow acceptance of consequence. Judge sentenced David Torr to 20 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. As she delivered the sentence, she made an unusual decision to address the courtroom beyond the immediate parties involved. "This case represents something both deeply troubling and profoundly hopeful," Judge said, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "The deeply troubling aspect is the calculated, systematic nature of the abuse perpetrated against a vulnerable child. The perpetrator didn't simply commit an act of violence. He engineered an entire psychological framework designed to ensure the victim's silence. He weaponized symbols of protection and safety. He exploited the trust of a parent. This represents the most insidious form of predatory behavior." She paused, and her expression shifted slightly. "But the hopeful aspect is this. A 3-year-old child found the courage to disclose her abuse through an unconventional means. She found voice in silence. She transformed a symbol of manipulation into a gateway for truth. And by doing so, she has changed how we as a society will approach trauma disclosures from the youngest and most vulnerable members of our community." Judge then made an announcement that would reverberate through law enforcement agencies across the state. She was formally endorsing a new training protocol, developed in collaboration with child psychologists, trauma specialists, and detective units throughout the region. This protocol, titled the Emma Protocol, Listening to the Unspoken, would be mandatory training for all law enforcement officers, school administrators, and child protection professionals. The announcement sparked immediate action. Detective Sarah and Officer were invited to present at a statewide law enforcement conference, where they detailed the case and the investigative methodology that had successfully identified and prosecuted TORs. Their presentation emphasized the importance of believing children, recognizing trauma disclosures in unconventional formats, and understanding the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that predators utilize. "Emma didn't describe her abuse in the traditional way," Officer explained to a room of 200 law enforcement professionals. "She didn't walk up to an adult and say, 'This man is hurting me.' Instead, she spoke in coded language through a perceived intermediary, a police dog, to communicate information that had been systematically suppressed. Our training needs to account for the reality that trauma-exposed children often communicate in non-linear, unconventional ways. We need to listen not just for direct disclosures, but for the underlying patterns and details that suggest something dangerous is occurring." Dr. Rachel contributed a section on the neurobiological impact of childhood trauma, explaining how Emma's nervous system had been conditioned to expect threat, and how predators deliberately leverage these neurological vulnerabilities to maintain control. She provided frameworks for recognizing trauma responses, and explained how law enforcement personnel could create environments that reduced re-traumatization while conducting investigations. The Emma Protocol was adopted by 17 state police departments within the first year, and eventually expanded to federal law enforcement agencies and specialized task forces. Training materials featured anonymized aspects of Emma's case, with particular emphasis on the role that unconventional disclosures play in identifying hidden abuse. Meanwhile, in the quiet spaces away from courtrooms and conferences, Emma's journey continued. Now almost 5 years old, she had progressed through therapy with remarkable resilience. Doctor noted in her reports that Emma was demonstrating exceptional psychological adaptability and developing healthy coping mechanisms for managing residual trauma responses. Sarah, Emma's mother, had completed her parenting education program and had extensive individual therapy addressing her own trauma. The trauma of discovering that she'd inadvertently placed her daughter in danger, the trauma of guilt and responsibility, the trauma of broken trust. After 6 months of supervised visitation, custody arrangements were modified to allow Emma to spend weekends with her mother, with full, unsupervised custody projected to resume after another 6 months of demonstrated stability. The bond between Sarah and Emma was rebuilding, slowly and carefully, with the support of doctors' family therapy sessions. Sarah had made significant life changes. She'd left her night shift job and found work at a community health center with daytime hours, ensuring she'd never again be absent during the vulnerable hours when her daughter might be at risk. She'd also become an advocate for child protection, volunteering with organizations focused on preventing child abuse and supporting survivors. Martinez, Emma's grandmother, had become an unexpected ambassador for trauma-informed care. She spoke to parent groups about recognizing warning signs of abuse, about the importance of believing children, and about the remarkable resilience that children can demonstrate when provided with consistent, loving support. Her home had become a sanctuary not just for Emma, but for other foster children in the system who needed temporary placement. Love for her granddaughter had transformed into a broader commitment to protecting all vulnerable children. Officer and Rex became the faces of the Emma Protocol Training Initiative. Their story, how a routine community demonstration had led to the identification of systematic child abuse, became a teaching tool for explaining why K-9 community outreach was never truly just about public relations. It was about creating connections, about positioning law enforcement personnel in spaces where children might find the courage to disclose hidden trauma. Rex, now 10 years old, was beginning to transition toward retirement from active duty. But before his retirement was finalized, the police department arranged something extraordinary, a formal recognition ceremony honoring Rex's role in Emma's case. The ceremony took place on a Saturday afternoon in the gymnasium where everything had begun, the same gymnasium at Riverside Elementary School where Emma had first whispered her secrets to the police dog. The space had been transformed. Hundreds of people filled the gymnasium: law enforcement officers, child protection advocates, school administrators, mental health professionals, and members of the community who'd been moved by Emma's story. Emma, now a kindergartner with her hair freshly braided and wearing a new dress that her grandmother had helped her choose, sat in the front row between and Sarah. Doctor sat beside them, available if Emma needed support during the emotionally significant event. Officer led Rex into the gymnasium on a ceremonial leash. The dog, sensing the significance of the moment, walked with particular dignity. As they approached the podium, the crowd stood in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Chief of Police Robert delivered remarks honoring Rex's service and, more significantly, honoring Emma's courage. This case reminds us that sometimes the most powerful voices are the smallest ones, Chief said, and sometimes those small voices speak in ways that we must learn to understand. Rex didn't solve this case through traditional police dog work. Rex solved this case by being present, by being safe, and by providing a vessel through which a traumatized child could finally find her voice. Then, in an unscripted moment, Officer brought Rex to where Emma was sitting. He didn't ask permission. He simply guided the dog to the child. Emma stood, her small hands reaching out to touch Rex's head. The dog lowered himself slightly, allowing the child to embrace him. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice carrying through a microphone that had been positioned near her. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for telling." There wasn't a dry eye in the gymnasium. As the ceremony concluded and people mingled, Officer found himself standing with Emma, Sarah, and Doctor. Emma looked up at him with an expression that seemed far too wise for her years. "Is David Torres in jail forever?" Emma asked. "Yes," Officer confirmed gently. "He's in jail forever because of what he did, and that's because you were brave enough to tell the truth." Emma nodded, processing this information. Then she said something that would stay with Officer for the rest of his career. "I wasn't brave. I was just scared and needed help. Rex was the one who was brave because he helped me even though I was scared." Officer kneeled down to Emma's level. "I think you were both brave, and I think the world is a safer place because you both were." As the evening light filtered through the gymnasium windows, casting those same golden stripes that had been present on that fateful Tuesday 6 months earlier, Emma stood between her grandmother and her mother, her hand resting on Rex's head. She was a child forever marked by what had been done to her, but she was also a child who had transformed her trauma into a force for systemic change. The Emma Protocol would go on to identify hundreds of cases of hidden abuse over the following years. Thousands of law enforcement officers would be trained using materials based on her case. Children across the country would find their voices through the frameworks that her disclosure had helped create. And in a quiet corner of a gymnasium in Riverside, a 3-year-old girl's whispered words to a police dog had become a clarion call for change. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the smallest act of courage. The end.